As Jenny said, today I'm going to be looking at these portraits in a corridor at Hampton Court. And I think I hope to show you that this seemingly innocuous row of portraits tells us a lot about a short period of British history called the Restoration, when women could achieve wealth and some power through their beauty. And these portraits are called the Windsor Beauties. They're all by Sir Peter Lely. You might incidentally wonder why they're called the Windsor Beauties when they're at Hampton Court. Well, they were originally they're at St. James's Palace. Then they were moved to Windsor Castle, and then they were moved to Hampton Court, and they were moved to Hampton Court in 1835. So they've been there some time, but the name has stuck, the Windsor Beauties, because downstairs at Hampton Court, there's another group of portraits from the William and Mary period known as the Hampton Court Beauties. But today I'm talking about the Windsor Beauties. But before I start on talking about these particular portraits, I wanted to set the scene by talking about the Restoration period, Sir Peter Lely, and the court of Charles II and his mistresses. So let me take you back there. Imagine it's 1660 and you're being presented at court to this person, the new king, Charles II. He's been living in exile abroad and he's just been invited back to reign. His father was beheaded 11 years previously. There's been the English Civil War and the Commonwealth experience. So the country is, to put it mildly, disorientated. Now, the Commonwealth period that we've lived through was a bleak time, particularly for public entertainment, which essentially didn't exist, but it was an exciting time intellectually. There were many new ideas about new forms of democracy, equality of the sexes and so on that were discussed during this period. But suddenly it's 1660, the top of society, the king has come back, and compared to the, what should we call it, dull, dreary, black and white Commonwealth period, suddenly we've turned into Technicolor. It's a bright new court, beauty, power, passion, and at the top of this pyramid of power was the new king, Charles II. Now, for the first time, and I think the only time in the history of British monarchy, Charles II publicly recognized his mistresses, and the role of mistress was an important role, and it enabled those women at court who were regarded as beautiful to achieve wealth, prestige, and power. I'll be talking about the limits of their power, but these new freedoms that were introduced at court spread through society. Women for the first time could appear on stage, actresses, write books and plays. But of course, it was still a totally male-dominated society. And this, the role of men compared with women was embedded in law, religious teaching, and the fabric of society itself. But just remember that although there was this gender hierarchy, there was also a hierarchy of status and rank, which was recognized by law and religion. And so although male superiority was taken for granted, it didn't mean all men were regarded as superior to all women. Women could occupy positions of power and authority, and the ultimate power was with the king. And the closer you were to the king, the more power you had indirectly from that relationship. So let's look at society and the role of women outside of the court. And let me quote you from an article that appeared during this period, describing a typical coffee house, which is what we see here. Mounting a few steps, we made our way into a big room which was equipped in an old-fashioned way. There was a rabble going hither and thither, reminding me of a swarm of rats in a ruinous cheese store. Some came, others went. Some were scribbling, others were talking. Some were drinking, some smoking, some arguing. The whole place smelt of tobacco like the cabin of a barge. So that's a typical coffee house. And the interesting thing is that women were not allowed to enter a coffee house as customers, but the coffee house was a bit like a gentleman's club. It was a place for men to gossip and talk about the news from the daily pamphlets. But they could, they did serve, and they could occasionally actually own and run a coffee house. Now, how did that come about? It was because although women couldn't own property, they could end up owning property if they inherited, or if their husband died. The law allowed the woman to take over the husband's and inherit the husband's property and business. So what we see here on the left is a woman who could be the owner. And just to give you an idea of, we have got some facts from the period, because the Sun Fire Insurance Company was founded at this time. And we know they still got their records from this time. And we know that something like 10% of all businesses in London were owned by women. So there was that role that women had in society through inheriting from their husband. I mentioned pamphlets, which is what the men are reading here. That's what's on the tables. They were all opinion. They were a bit like social media. And it was a woman who had the idea, the novel idea, but it became very popular, of having a daily pamphlet that actually contained what we call news, facts. It hadn't been done before. The woman was Elizabeth Mallet, and she was the editor and publisher of the first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant. And what distinguished it from the others is it actually had the facts of what was going on rather than opinion. So that was another way in which women started to take on new roles in society. What I'm going to do now is just to quickly go through 4 well-known women, just to show you the different roles that women could take on in society. The first one is Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle. She was the first woman scientist. She actually wrote 21 books. She was actually the first person to publish a work of science fiction, and which I've read, a very interesting work. She was what we would call today a feminist, and she was regarded by her contemporaries as being eccentric, flirtatious. It was said that her speech was full of oaths and obscenities, and she was noted for her unusual dress sense. But of course, she was a duchess, so she could get away with things and had a powerful position. But Mary Beale, seen here in this self-portrait, her father was a rector, so not part of nobility. And she was one of the most successful portrait painters of the 17th century, and I mean of either sex. She became the principal earner for the family, and her husband, who prior to the plague and the Great Fire worked in the civil service, spent his time, when they came back to London, doing her accounts, keeping her accounts, grinding her pigments and so on. She didn't have a studio. He did all the manual work for her. Aphra Behn, who again was, we don't know much about her actually. She's a bit of a mystery, but we think her father was a barber. And she was self-taught. And she became one of the leading playwrights. She wrote 19 plays, which were successful. And she I think she wrote more plays than any other playwright except for John Dryden, the poet laureate. She was known for her bawdy works and her masculine style, and she led a life, and this is a quote, dedicated to pleasure and poetry. And she wasn't interested in women's rights. In fact, she wasn't interested in anybody else's any rights except for her own. And then finally, actresses. This is the first professional actress on the English stage. Just to explain one aspect of that, prior to the banning of theatre in 1642, women's roles were all performed by men, but there were, I don't know what were regarded at the time as embarrassing incidents concerning what was called at the time unnatural vices. And as a result of that, Charles, who wanted to stop this, decreed that from then on, from when he came back 1660, female roles could only be played by women. So suddenly there was another opportunity for women actresses. Samuel Pepys described who I think is Margaret Hughes. I know here it says possibly Margaret Hughes, but I think it is Margaret Hughes. Considered her what he called a mighty pretty woman, and seems, but is not, modest. Now, you might be wondering about the breast. It wasn't regarded as shocking in those days as it is today, but showing an ankle was shocking. That was regarded as immoral. So if you like, in those days, showing an ankle would be equivalent to showing a breast today. But why? There were many reasons. One reason was to indicate that the woman was young, virginal, innocent, and hadn't yet had any children. But Margaret Hughes when this was painted was about 40. Another reason was to signify that the woman was a mistress, and here we see a spaniel dog, which was the dog of the Stuarts. So the indication is that maybe it signals that she's a royal mistress, which she was. She was mistress of Prince Rupert, Duke of Cumberland. And there's another aspect of this portrait which could be related to that, and that's her left hand is resting on this golden object, which could be a jar, and a jar containing ointment, and that would make it a symbol of Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene is normally shown in Western art as a repentant sinner, and often shown with a bare breast. So it could be that she's referencing Mary Magdalene here. But let's talk about the artist who painted. Notice that Peter Lely painted all three of those four. Mary Beale, it was a self-portrait, but she painted in the style of Peter Lely and was a good friend of his. And often he would refer customers to her who couldn't afford Peter Lely's work. He was born Peter van der Vaas to Dutch parents. He was actually born in what's now northern Germany. And on the gable of his father's house, there was a heraldic lily. And so when he came to England, he changed his name to Lily, or the Dutch equivalent of Lily, which is pronounced Lely, which is why I call him Lely. But many experts call him Lily or Lely or Lely. You'll hear all of them, and all of them are correct. There's no correct. You just say his name in a way that you feel comfortable, and it'll be correct. I mean, I have seen at conferences various world experts all sticking with their pronunciation and all saying it differently. Well, he arrived in London in 1641, which is a good year for him to arrive personally. He was 23, and it was the year that Anthony van Dyck died, and he, Lely, replaced him as court painter. And it was also a time when many other well-known artists had died or left London, more or less at this time. Mark Gerrits had died. Paul Van Summer had died. Daniel Meitens died soon. Cornelius Johnson went back to the Netherlands. William Dobson, the English artist, had starting to fade out of power, died in poverty, actually. So Lely was seen as Van Dyck's successor, and he was keen to show it. He behaved in what was described as a lordly manner. He wore a sword. He always, when he went out, he would have servants surrounding him. Pepys described him as a mighty proud man and full of state. He collected an art collection around him. And when he first arrived, he didn't want to be a portrait painter. He painted religious and mythological scenes. And this one at Dulwich Picture Gallery, you might have seen. It's Nymphs by a Fountain, so it's a mythological scene, and it was painted in the 1650s, of say 10 years after he'd come to the country, and it was Puritan England, remember? So it's likely that this was commissioned for a private home where it probably would have been kept behind a curtain. And the reason such paintings were regarded as acceptable in Puritan England, and not, I would imagine, with all Puritans, is because they claim to be a classical scene. And in this case, it's not a mythological tale. It's reference to the classical world is simply through the sculptures you see in the background on the right, where it's maybe not particularly clear, but there's three putti or cupids in the background surrounding that creature, which is actually a dolphin. But really, I think it's an excuse for showing naked ladies or semi-draped. So that's the style, but he quickly started to become well known as a portrait painter, and most of the work he did from this time onwards was portrait painting. For example, this painting by Peter Lely, a different portrait of Charles II in armour, standing in front of the crown. You saw the crown in the last picture that I showed you. It's not, in fact, the St. Edward crown that dates back to Edward the Confessor. That was destroyed by Cromwell. It was broken up and sold because Cromwell said he hated the detestable rule of kings, he called it, and wanted to remove all reference to kings. So what Charles did when he came to the throne is he had it recreated, he remade it, and the crown jewels alone cost over £12,000. And on top of that, he spent a further 18,000 on 2 tons of altar and banqueting plate, gold plate. Enough, I mean, £12,000 is what would buy you 3 warships, just to give you an idea of how much money that was. So all power resided in this chap, in the king, and flowed from the king. So if you had a relationship with the king, that brought you power through that relationship. And I'm going to show you 3 more, 3 mistresses of Charles out of the, well, the number varies, but some say 13. Pepys reckon there were 17 mistresses. First of all, perhaps the best known, Barbara Villiers. All of these are paintings by Peter Lely. And she had 5 children by Charles, of which were recognized by him as his children, and the 3 boys were all made dukes, and 2 of the girls were made countesses, and in fact there was a 6th child who he said wasn't his. This it says portrait of a young woman, but looking at other portraits of her, I think, to me, it's fairly clear that this is Nell Gwyn. I'm just talking about a few of his well-known mistresses, and the final, the third well-known mistress is Louise de Kerway, or as the English called her, Miss Cartwheel. She was French mistress. She replaced Barbara Villiers. In fact, she replaced her shortly after the passing of the Test Act. The Test Act, well, there were three Test Acts. Well, the 1673 Test Act prevented Catholics from holding high office. And in this case, she was Lady of the Bedchamber, so she lost her job. Barbara Villiers lost her job. And she sort of went into retirement, and the official leading mistress of the day became Miss Cartwheel. Now, before I get started on the Windsor Beauties, there's 3 slides which set different contexts on the pictures. First of all, beauty. It was very highly valued, and it was associated with virtue. If you were outwardly beautiful, it sort of implied, it meant that you were inwardly beautiful, i.e. virtuous. That was taken for granted. That was seen as obvious. And so everyone, men and women, became slaves to beautifying themselves and the use of cosmetics and wigs. And we see here, this is actually a French engraving, but we see here on the left, in English, age adorned by folly. You can see it's folly because of the contraption she's wearing over her shoulder, adorned by folly with the attributes of youth. She's putting a beauty spot on her face. They were very popular, partly sometimes to hide smallpox scars, but not necessarily. They were used because they were thought to be beautiful. The illustration on the right is interesting. It's by Mary Astell, an early feminist writer, and in one of her books, Some Reflections Upon Marriage, she wrote, and I quite like this one, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? And she was one of the first to argue from a basis of logic and reason rather than historical precedents that men and women were equal. But she also wrote this book of this is the frontispiece, an essay in defense of the female sex, where she talks about the vanity of men. And I'll just quote one short section. There's lots of good sections in this book, but talking about men, she says, he examines and refreshes his complexion by his glass mirror and is more dejected at a pimple than if it were a cancer, she writes in the book. The men and women use copious amounts of powders, paints, and various cosmetics, and they knew that they often used lead white because a white face was regarded as desirable. And in fact, Charles II's wife, Catherine of Braganza, she was before she married, she was a princess from Portugal. It was commented she had olivada, or olive complexion, which was, and this is a quote, not regarded as, it was sufficiently unagreeable, is the way that John Evelyn, the diarist, put it. So a pure complexion, a white complexion, was essential, and they used white lead, but they knew it was poisonous. I've got another quote here. A courtier wrote that Lady Henrietta Wentworth sacrificed her life to beauty by painting so beyond measure that the mercury got into her nerves and killed her. So they knew lead and mercury. Incidentally, mercury was mercury sulfide was in rouge, and they used rouge to give them a blush, because blushing was regarded as a sign of virginity and modesty, and very desirable, as we'll see later with one of the Windsor Beauties. But commenting on the Windsor Beauties' style and technique, you can see here that it's easy to confuse them. And these particular portraits have over the years been mistitled. You'll see them with other titles in books. And I won't bore you with the other titles that they've been given, but these titles, Mary Baggot and Frances Brooke, are the ones that are generally accepted now and the ones that I go with. So why are they so similar? Well, it's to do with the technique Peter Lely used. He had a large studio, and if you wanted your portrait done, you would typically visit his studio for an hour, once, twice, sometimes 3 times, and he would sketch just your face. Then you would choose from a pattern book the pose you wanted, the color of the clothing, the drapery, and the background. And then often his apprentices would paint the foliage, the drapery, the background, and then Lely would paint the hands and the face. So when he painted them, he idealized them, and he added what he called grace and what we would call sex appeal. And in those days, sex appeal was a low-cut neckline, an exposed neck, shoulders, and chest, heavily lidded eyes, well-defined eyebrows, thick, heavy eyebrows, a full mouth, and flowing hair with ringlets. And there's also this thing that it's difficult to define, but this thing that's sometimes called a drowsy sweetness about them. So there's this combination of sensuality but dignity combined, a difficult two to combine, but that's what he aimed to do. That's what people sought. By the way, that is John Wright again, the one who painted that first portrait we saw of Charles II. And that's a different portrait of Mary Baggot, just to show you how difficult it is looking at different portraits. You might think it's easy by finding other portraits of them, but that's just to show you it's not that easy. And then finally, before starting the Windsor Beauties, this is the person who commissioned them, Anne Hyde, who was the Duchess of York, in other words, the wife of James, the Duke of York, who became James II. So an important person at the court, and she commissioned the Windsor Beauties. Incidentally, the man in the street, so to speak, would see the Windsor Beauties as well, because they were turned into engravings, and so they were available for people to admire or possibly leer over. So let's get started, and let me quickly, I should just explain that this corridor, which goes from the top of the Queen's staircase and just the entrance into the Cumberland Suite, down the other end of this corridor is the cartoon gallery, and I'll take you down this corridor, and I'm going to be using nicknames which were either used at the time or based on descriptions in diaries of the period. So the first one we're going to see is Elizabeth Hamilton, I call the Joker, and she was known for that at the time. This is Barbara Villiers, the Uncrowned Queen. Then Margaret Brooke, Death by Chocolate. Anne Digby, Countess of Sunderland, the Flatterer. Elizabeth Risley, Countess of Northumberland, the Hidden Beauty. Then up here, Lady Byron, number 17. Frances Stewart, the Pretty One. Frances Brooke, the Quiet One. Followed by Henrietta Boyle, the Poisoner. Jane Middleton, the Smelly One. And finally, number 10, Mary Baggot, the Blusher that I mentioned. So I've given them nicknames, but they were the way that people referred to them at the time. This is looking back down the corridor. So I'll start at the beginning. The first one we saw, Elizabeth Hamilton, was the original court beauty that all the other ladies copied. And arguably this is the first, the greatest example of Lely's skill combining beauty and a true likeness. She was known as La Belle Hamilton, and we'll come across another Belle later, La Belle Stuart, but La Belle Hamilton was the original beauty. She didn't have much of a fortune, but she was courted by many people at court because of her beauty. As I said, it got you noticed, and it attracted the highest of nobility and royalty. By the way, she's shown here. Notice she's holding a palm frond. And if you look in the background, you'll see that there's part of what's a wheel. You can see the sort of three, what look like teeth. They were from the wheel. And she is showing herself as Saint Catherine. And I think this is probably a tribute to the Queen, Catherine of Braganza, because of course her name was Elizabeth Hamilton. So the portrait is claiming that she embodied not just external beauty, but the internal virtues of Saint Catherine, piety and chastity. And by reference to the Queen, Catherine of Braganza, she's implying that they are attributes of the Queen as well. Hamilton was intelligent and witty, and she loved practical jokes and mischief. She was well known at court for that. I'll give you one example. There were two maids of honor, and they both loved the same French marquis. And she, Elizabeth Hamilton, convinced them that he loved exotic costumes. And so she convinced them to go to the same ball together, dressed absurdly and identically as Babylonian princesses wearing yellow ribbons. It reminds me a bit of Twelfth Night and Malvolio and his yellow stockings, but she convinced them to go wearing this silly costume just for a joke, just for fun. Wasn't so much fun for them, but that's typical of practical jokes. The most famous of all of the mistresses, and in fact, the only officially recognized mistress of all the Windsor Beauties. Some people think of all the Windsor Beauties as mistresses of the king. They weren't. This is the one that's the mistress. The second one down the corridor, Barbara Villiers. I should add, by the way, that I went to the corridor last week and they'd completely changed the order of all the pictures, and I had to redo this presentation because they used to be in a different order. So, but if you went some time ago, you might remember them as in a different order. But what I'm showing you is the order they were in last week. So number 2, Barbara Villiers, was known as the Uncrowned Queen because of the power she had. But the diarist John Evelyn described her as the curse of the nation, another nickname she acquired. She had a foul temper. She was extravagant, gambled, and was promiscuous in the sense that while she was mistress of the king, this was almost unheard of, but while she was mistress of the king, she took on other lovers at the same time. She became a Catholic to get closer to Charles, but in fact, following the Test Act, that means that she actually lost her position at court. She was also Peter Lely's muse. I think he was, well, we know he was much taken by her, and he painted something like 10 portraits of her. And this is a quote from Peter Lely, that it was beyond the compass of art to give this lady her due as to her sweetness and exquisite beauty. So we know she had a foul temper, but all he saw through, because of her external beauty, was her sweetness and exquisite beauty. Incidentally, she's dressed as Minerva, and these clothes that all of them are wearing weren't the clothes they wore. They were just drapes. It was a sort of pseudo classicizing of them. It was to make them look like classical figures. they're all wearing these. I mean, they didn't actually wear them. They just went wearing their normal clothes to have their sketch drawn by Peter Lely. The costumes were maybe modelled by other women, but were often painted by apprentices. And she's dressed as Minerva, goddess of wisdom, and she has her hand on a shield which has the Gorgon Medusa's head that would turn her enemies to stone, and in this case emphasizes her beauty through the contrast with the horror of the Gorgon's head. The thing, well, let me move on. Oh, just to say that, just to show the sort of person she was, she had Lely paint her as the Virgin Mary, and her first son, Charles Fitzroy, who became the Duke of Northumberland, is painted as Christ. Death by chocolate. Margaret Brooke, or Lady Denham, became mistress of James, Duke of York, who was to become James II, after she had married the poet Sir John Denham, and James became obsessed with her and would follow her everywhere. And I think it got too serious because she became ill. She suspected she'd been poisoned, and she insisted that if she died, that an autopsy be carried out. And she did die, and an autopsy was carried out, and it said that she died of natural causes and no poison was found in her body, but no one believed it at the time. Many rumours started. Pepys, Samuel Pepys and others believed she'd been murdered by being given a poisoned cup of chocolate. So the belief at the time, and I think John Evelyn said the same, that it was death by chocolate. So if she was poisoned, who did it? There were many suspects, many rumours circulated in the coffee houses. Some thought it was Anne Hyde, James's wife. Some thought it was her husband, who was, to say the least, much put out. In fact, after her death, her husband started to, the only way I can put it is to go mad, and he died 2 years later. And he's buried at Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And there were others that we will see later. Henrietta Boyle, for example, who was Anne Hyde's sister-in-law, was accused of murdering her, poisoning her. And that's James, Duke of York, who got obsessed with her. The flatterer, Anne Digby, but she was described by Anne Hyde, James's wife, as a flattering, dissembling, false woman. But she has so fawning and endearing a way that she will deceive anybody at first. It's very difficult to know whether that's an accurate description, because different people give different descriptions of her, but I've chosen to accept Anne Hyde's description, which is why I've called her the flatterer. In a false woman is the way she described her. She became a close friend, that is Anne Spencer, became a close friend of what was then Princess Anne, who became Queen Anne. And she also became a close friend later of Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, who was much disliked by Queen Anne, who became jealous of their friendship. But that's another story. Now, John Evelyn described her as a woman of good character, and it does seem as though she was devoted to her husband and lived a long and happy life. And in fact, a biographer of her husband, Robert Spencer, describes his happy marriage, which was sustained by Anne Spencer through his long and unhappy life. Incidentally, all of the portraits you're seeing are by Peter Lely's own hand, and in some cases we think he painted the whole picture, which was unusual, as I've already said. except in this case. So this one is thought to be, have I put it there? No, yes, I've written studio copy of Peter. So we think this is a later copy by his studio, because if you look at the drapery, it looks more like squiggles of paint. It doesn't resolve itself into satin in the same way. So we think it's not Peter Lely's hand, although he did paint a portrait that looks the same as this. This is a copy. And well, let's move on to the hidden beauty. Lady Risley, Countess of Northumberland, later Countess of Montague. Now, she lived a successful, happy, or happy-ish, uncontroversial life. She married this chap, Jocelyn Percy, who, if you've been to Sion House, you might have come across the name, the 11th Earl of Northumberland, when she was 16 and he was 18. He was going to marry her sister Audrey, but she died and he married her sister instead. And she was known at court for her beauty. Samuel Pepys wrote, "A beautiful lady indeed." But her husband was frequently ill, and he noticed that she was attracting the attention of King Charles, and so he whisked her away, which is why I call her the hidden beauty. He took her with him to Paris as he started the grand tour, but he left her in Paris with actually the philosopher John Locke, who he took with him, and went on to Italy as part of the grand tour on his own, but suddenly died in Turin, aged 25, and that left her free. She returned to England, a rich widow, and she became chatelaine of Sion House. And then later she married the Duke of Montague, who was the ambassador to Paris, and died a wealthy woman, but died fairly young. She died when she was 44. There was no direct male line for the Percy family, but the family continued through their daughter Elizabeth, and then later their granddaughter Elizabeth, the first Duchess of Northumberland. This is the painting in the middle of the series, and it's not one of the original Windsor Beauties, but it did join the group in 1710 in Queen Anne's waiting room, or possibly her state bedchamber. We don't know which. So it has a claim to be part of the Windsor Beauties, but it's not one of the original Windsor Beauties. It was painted by Peter Lely, and it's Lady Byron, Eleanor Needham. And she is, again, we see St. Catherine, and that again is probably to flatter Catherine of Braganza, Charles II's queen. She was, the reason I call her number 17 is Samuel Pepys in his diary claimed she was the 17th mistress of Charles II. Historians haven't got up to 17. There's usually, from what I can find, a list of 13 known mistresses of some just short term, but Samuel Pepys obviously counted more. He called her the 17th mistress. So there she is, number 17. This is Frances Teresa Stuart, and she, I mean, they were all beauties of the court. They were selected as the beauties of the court, and that's why Anne Hyde commissioned them, because they were the leading beauties of the court. But this Frances Stuart was regarded as the outstanding beauty and was known as La Belle Stuart, or some people called her the Pretty One, which is what I call her here. She is being shown here as the chaste virgin huntress Diana. She's holding Diana's hunting bow, and she was chaste. She was certainly chased around the palace by Charles II shortly after she arrived from Paris as a teenager. But she became famous for refusing to become his mistress. So not unheard of, but unusual. He continued to chase her, though. Samuel Pepys described her as the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, making his wife jealous. When he first saw her, he wrote in his diary that that night he had been fancying myself to sport with Mrs. Stuart. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. She, until recently, was well known to all of us as the model for Britannia, and she was on our coins, our 50p coin, up to 2008. She was allegedly chosen by Charles to represent Britannia on a medal that was produced at the time, and then that image got transferred to the coinage and ended up so she was the face of Britannia, or if you like, the face of Britain for 350 years, and famous for holding off the king's advances. But the king fell deeply in love with her. In fact, when Catherine of Braganza fell ill, she didn't actually die, but when she fell ill, he said he intended to marry Frances Stuart after she died. And he later considered obtaining a divorce to marry Frances Stuart. But Francis, who couldn't run away from him any longer, married the third Duke of Richmond, and who became the sixth Duke of Lennox, and the king forgave her. The quiet one. Frances Brooke. Now, she was the sister of Margaret Brooke. Remember Margaret Brooke, the third one we saw, Death by Chocolate. So she was the sister of Death by Chocolate. And they were both daughters of a knight, so not high, no, but gentry, if you like, who had died. He died fighting on the parliamentary side during the Civil War. And so the family was a bit out of favor with the restored court of Charles II. And so their uncle brought them to court as teenagers to increase his influence with Charles. So you could obtain power, you could get closer to the monarch if you had a beautiful woman with you who Charles liked the look of, and that enabled you to get closer and therefore to obtain more power. She was said, Frances Brooke was said to have possessed heavily marked features, thick eyebrows, which remember was fashionable, but a long, rather ugly nose, well-formed but large mouth, which was fashionable, and dark hair. And she didn't succumb to, what should we call it, court temptation, but she did marry. She married twice before dying in her 40s. A quiet life. So she didn't, once she'd married, she lived at home, didn't visit court unusually, and led a quiet life of domesticity. So that was an option for women as well, although she came from a more lowly background. She obtained a good marriage through her beauty, but then retired from court. Now, remember Death by Chocolate, and I said that one of the rumored poisoners, one of the rumors going through the coffee houses, was Henrietta Boyle. Well, this is Henrietta Boyle, which is why I've called her the poisoner, but I've added a question mark because the best evidence we have from the autopsy was that she wasn't poisoned anyway, but that was the rumor at the time. She married Lawrence Hyde. And yes, it was the same family. Lawrence was the brother of Anne Hyde, Duchess of York, the first wife of James II. So Henrietta Boyle was well connected. And she came from a family that over a couple of generations became one of the most powerful, or the most powerful family in the south of Ireland. And like the rest of her family, she was very strong-minded, ruthless, and acquisitive. Every possible perk, every possible earnings that she could acquire, she did. And she had bitter clashes with her husband's niece, Princess Anne, the future Queen Anne, over who should have the best apartments at Whitehall Palace. And it was Henrietta Boyle who won that contest, if you like, and took over an apartment, the biggest apartment in Whitehall Palace, of 23 rooms. Anne herself could be a formidable opponent, and she complained bitterly of her aunt's peevishness. And when I said poisoner, I remember before I mentioned Samuel Pepys, but also John Aubrey, the diarist, wrote of Margaret Brooke. In fact, she was poisoned by the hands of the Countess of Rochester with chocolate. And this is the Countess of Rochester. So there were a number of people who went into writing about these rumours, but we've got no idea about whether they're true or not. The Smelly One. You might think I'm making this up, but Jane Middleton, or Jane Needham, married Middleton. Jane Middleton was described by John Evelyn, again the diarist, as that famous and indeed incomparable beauty. But Samuel Pepys, who agreed with that, added she was silly and sentimental and thought herself a great wit, but was considered by society as boring and tiresome. And then he added, she was noted for carrying about her body a continued sour base smell that is very offensive. And in fact, he records a meal he had one evening with another lady at court, where they discussed her smell and how foul it was, particularly in hot weather, they said. And this raises the question of personal hygiene. And although in the Middle Ages people did bathe, they didn't bathe as much in the 17th century. And it's difficult to generalize. Many wealthy people would wash regularly, and they would wipe their hands and face with a cloth, sometimes a dry cloth, sometimes a wet cloth. So they would sort of wash their hands and face. But some people went to a bathhouse, and there's a story Samuel Pepys records that his wife on one occasion refused to let him into the marriage bed until he'd washed. And in fact, it was 3 days before he relented and went to the bathhouse. His wife frequently went to the bathhouse, and he relented and went there himself. So that wasn't unknown. That wasn't strange or unusual. People were just a bit worried about taking their clothes off, entering cold water, and getting a chill. So it was to do with protecting their body and worried about illness. And another example from the 17th century bestseller, The English Housewife, or as it says here, huswife. And it recommended a bath for clearing the skin. But when I looked at the ingredients, the bath consists of perfumes, which is fine, nettles, various other ingredients of an undesirable kind, and 2 or 3 gallons of milk. So I don't know how that would leave you smelling, but their baths took different forms. As I said, her striking beauty was the only qualification for advancement. In other words, her smell, her alleged smell, didn't put people off. She was chased at court by many people, including the Duke of York. And she was well known for her pride, and she was well known for her unwillingness to have a bath, but she was still pursued by the Duke of York and Charles II. But she resisted becoming a royal mistress, but she did, we don't know why, but she did become the mistress of the Duke of Montague and later the Earl of Rochester, and married Mr. Middleton. Finally, number 10, Mary Baggot. She was one of those I showed you earlier about the similar looking portraits. She had humble beginnings. She was the daughter of a impoverished but loyal cavalier, an officer. But her beauty enabled her to marry the Earl of Falmouth, who, as it happened, died 2 years later in battle when he had his head blown off by a cannonball. And she became much sought after, a sort of what was called at the time a trophy wife, despite her humble origins. And again, James, Duke of York, considered marrying her. He said he would marry her when his wife Anne Hyde died. Instead, she married Charles Sackville, one of the Sackvilles, later Earl of Dorset, and she became mistress of Charles II, who granted her lands, including Somerset House in the Strand and a state pension. So you could do, financially, you could do very well becoming a mistress. Now, she's the one, I've called her the blusher. I've shown you a bit of an enlargement, although I think you could probably see it in the original painting, that she's cheeks are shown blushed. And a lot of people use rouge, but she didn't need to. She was one of those people who blushed at the slightest provocation. And blushing was regarded as a sign of virginity, which was equated with virtue. So she was seen to be both beautiful externally and obviously beautiful of great virtue internally as well. And she didn't need to use rouge. As I've said, it was made from cinnabar, which was mercury sulfide. And just to give you another example of someone who died, the Countess of Coventry died of blood poisoning at the age of 27. And it was thought at the time to be mercury poisoning. Also, mercury, rouge, cinnabar, could destroy the teeth. It turned them black. It made your breath stink. It made you salivate. These are all symptoms of mercury poisoning. So they put up with these things in order to look beautiful because it was so important at court. That brings us to the end of my little story of the 10 Windsor Beauties.